Evening. I'm pleased to introduce Shannon Butler, who will speak on the topic of historic murders in Dutchess County from the 18th through the early 20th century. Shannon is the historian for the Poughkeepsie Public Library District. She's worked in local history for about 16 years as the historian for Hyde Park and also as a park ranger for the Roosevelt Vanderbilt Historic Sites. She's written 2 books and many articles, and she has a master's degree in history from SUNY Albany, and she's also the creator and co-host of a historical podcast entitled All My Favorite People Are Dead. Without further introduction, Shannon?
Okay, so this is kind of weird for me, doing a Zoom hybrid thingy. Hi there on the interweb, all 12 of you. And hi to everyone here at the lovely meeting house. So yeah, we're going to be talking about some pretty gruesome things tonight. I got a whole list of murders. I've done a lot of research on this. It kind of came to be a couple things happened. Number one, when I started my job at the Poughkeepsie Public Library, there was a box in our local history room marked miscellaneous murders. So I'm like, well, that sounds like fun. So let me go ahead and dig through that. And then I just kind of went through there and continued my search through various newspapers and other sources, which we'll get into. But it's been kind of wild, and the response has been equally wild. Lots of people want to hear juicy, gory, horrible murders. With that in mind, disclaimer, that's sort of trigger warning, as they say. We are going to talk about some pretty brutal stuff in this discussion. I actually had to cut it down because the original talk was well over 2 hours. And I was actually, when I first gave the talk at the library, we had over 100 people in attendance, and I was able to keep them glued to their seats for well over 2 hours. So, which I thought, wow, you guys are just as messed up as I am, which is good. And I think this next, let's see, doesn't want to move forward or backward. Oh, that's good. I have no. I'm doing the up and down button and nothing's moving. And the side to side button. Oh, here we go. I'm just going to click. I guess clicking works.
Did we put the sidebar? Yeah.
How do I get rid of that? I have no idea.
Look at more. Oh, there you go. You can drag it. Drag it down all the way down.
Drag it there. There we go. All right. Well, it's still going to stay there. Okay. So this is put it to the side.
I want to see go up or down.
No, it won't stay. Yeah. Anyway, this meme, I felt connected with a lot of people when I first saw it. When you realize the only 2 things you've accomplished during the quarantine was gain weight and learn how to dispose of a dead body. I know that, you know that true crime is very popular when, like, all the big shows like Dateline, 2020, people are glued to the TV for those. All the big podcasts are murder and true crime related. My particular, I love to listen to Morbid is a true crime podcast, which is these 2 girls who are hysterical. My Favorite Murder is another really juicy one that's fun to listen to. But it's really weird how people are naturally drawn to this very weird subject matter. But like I said, we are going to be talking about stabbings, shootings. We even mentioned a rape in one of the talks. So just a trigger warning, there is some brutal stuff we're going to be discussing. I also decided that I wanted to kind of focus on really early stuff and nothing too recent. I wanted to make sure that just about everybody involved in said crime was definitely dead, so that we didn't really kind of bother anybody with the discussion that we're really having. So the latest crime we'll be discussing is like 1931. We don't go any further than that. A lot of people came up to me when I first did this, and they're like, well, I heard you going to talk about the history teacher from Poughkeepsie High School who was like eating students. And I'm like, nah. I think, well, there's a lot of people who still remember that one. So we're going to not. So we start with early documents, and we actually have some court records in our collections at the Adrian's Memorial Library. that show us some interesting crimes. For example, this one here, which is from 1762. And since it's really, really early, even before the Poughkeepsie Journal has established itself, and Poughkeepsie Journal is very early too. That's 1785 that starts getting underway. So this early document is all I have of the what looks like in the document. Johannes Hotelling killing somebody by shooting him with a flintlock musket. And this record is all we have of that. So we don't know what else happened after that. I tried researching to see what other things came after that, but it's not really until you get the Poughkeepsie Journal that you really start to get a lot of juicy tidbits. So our first real major murder that we really have a lot to go by is in 1793. So the Poughkeepsie Journal is well established at this point. And we have the case of Ezra Mead, who apparently murdered this guy named Jacob Horton in Fishkill in 1793. There was a fight that had taken place. Jacob Horton was blaming Ezra Mead for abusing his sister, quote unquote. Now, I don't know what exactly that means, but they didn't go into, sometimes they went into brutal details, and on other times they kind of held back, especially when it came to sexual things like that. But the fight, what happens is that Ezra Mead and Jacob Horton are having this little tuss of things and sort of arguing over this case. And finally, they decide to sort of walk out of the house in Fishkill that they lived in together. And Ezra Mead was saying, well, let's work this out. We can work things out, can't we? And then as they leave the house, Jacob Horton trips and Ezra Mead stabs him in the gut. And the newspapers were very blunt about it. They proclaimed, quote, "Some persons running out found him standing holding up his bowels, which had fallen out by reason of the wound received. He languished till Monday, when he expired." The Poughkeepsie Journal was very flowery on some of these things, shall we say. And then they had a tagline. Does anybody know the Poughkeepsie Journal's old tagline? It was "neutral in nothing," which is, I find hysterical for a newspaper, yes. So neutral in nothing. But to kind of emphasize this neutral in nothing, they went on to say in this article here, "We are happy to inform the public that the murderer is safely lodged in jail in this town, and we hope he will meet the reward he merits." So this is a newspaper saying, we hope he gets hanged for his, his terrible deeds. And actually he would be. Let's see here. So this right here is an image of the basement of the old courthouse, Dutchess County Courthouse. Which has always been in the same location on the corner of Main and Market Streets in the city of Poughkeepsie. Now, the building that's there now is like the 5th version of the building there's always been a building there on that specific corner. And the deed actually states that there always has to be a jail cell in the basement. So there's still a jail cell in the basement to this day. It's now just storage. And I'll show you guys a photograph of that at the end of the program, because I was able to sort of sneak into the Dutchess County Courthouse. It's amazing what you can get away with when you say, "Hi, I'm a historian, and I'm really interested in this thing that you have in your," and the security guard was very nice. He's like, "Oh, I think there is a old jail cell down there." I was like, "Can I see it?" He's like, "Yeah, I'll take you down there." I'm like, cool. So we went down, and sure enough, it was chock full all the way to the brim of HVAC supplies, all this old county objects and mechanical things and whatnot. I was like, "Oh, well, that's interesting. Can I take a picture of it?" And he's like, "Oh, no, that's above my pay grade. You're gonna have to talk to somebody higher about that." So I said, "Okay, well, I will." And so I reached out to my buddy, Will Tatum, the county historian. I was like, "Hey, do you think I could take a picture of that jail cell down there?" And he's like, "Yeah, I don't see why not." So somebody had gotten the word out that a historian was coming to photograph the jail cell because they emptied it for me. And when I got there, it was nice and clean. I was like, "Oh, look at that." So we'll show you a picture of what it looks like today. But this is what it would have looked like when Mr. Ezra Mead would have been cooling his heels there in 1793 for his dastardly deed. So, of course, it didn't take long for him to be found guilty and sentenced, because just about anybody who was on the street in Fishkill saw him do this deed to poor Jacob Horton. And at the At the execution that took place in 1793, he decided to give his last words. They asked, do you have any last words? And he said, I do, in fact. And it went on like this. I, Ezra Mead, aged 40 years, was born in Stamford in the state of Connecticut, of honest and credible parents with whom I've lived until I was about 10, when I was bound as an apprentice to learn the cooper's trade. And then he goes on, and like he is telling his entire life story to kind of like prolong his execution. He goes on and on and on and on. And then at the end he goes, I do further declare that I never have been guilty of any other crime deserving such punishment as has been represented or reported by many evil-minded persons since my imprisonment, and that I forgive all mankind and hope the Lord and they will forgive me, and that they will take warning by my untimely end. Farewell. It's a very dramatic final speech. But I thought when I found that in the papers, I'm like, oh, that's a good one. We got to share that one. But moving on to 1804, we have a really messy one here. This is actually, I found this not in the Poughkeepsie Journal, but in another short-lived Poughkeepsie newspaper called the Political Barometer, which we have microfilm of in our collection. And this took place in Rhinebeck. A man named Peter Shaver decided to bash in his sister's skull with a hatchet, apparently an axe, actually. He was 43 years old. His sister was slightly younger. The paper claimed that Peter was insane when he did this and was immediately apprehended and brought to the jail in Poughkeepsie, though it did take a while before he was finally tried and executed. Now, here we see two mentions side by side, or one on top of the other, in the Political Barometer, that the Poughkeepsie paper I was telling you about. In one, the Dutchess County Sheriff, Joseph Thorne, is asking all local constables for aid in bringing this prisoner to his place of execution. We're having a little marching parade from the jail to the hanging tree, essentially. Now, and then another one below says, it says, I'm sorry, the one on top says, the confession of Peter Schaefer respecting the murder of his sister will be for sale on the day of execution at the office of the Barometer. This is an advertisement for what many people refer to as murder pamphlets. Now, murder pamphlets were these great little pieces produced by local newspapers generally, and they would have the full story on the murder, the trial, the criminal, the execution, everything. They would have these very detailed and sometimes a little more creative, shall we say, in detail of these crimes and so forth. And the papers would sell them separately at their publishing offices, separate from the paper itself. These things sold like hotcakes. They were essentially, the 19th century version of 2020. So we do have a few murder pamphlets in our collection from the time period, which I'm going to showcase for you guys. Aha, here we go. The one on the left, The Life and Confessions of Lucianne Hoeg, I actually had to track this one down. It's not in our collection, but I found a copy in the New York State Library up in Albany. And the other one, The Trial of Wesley Pine, is in our collection. We'll be talking about both of these interesting trials. Lucianne Hoeg is particularly interesting to me because she's, I think, only the third or fourth woman in all of New York State's history to be executed. And she was executed right at the Dutchess County Courthouse in Poughkeepsie. And she was also a really stupid criminal, but we'll get into that. Now, these are just a couple of murder pamphlets that I've been able to find. Now, supposedly, as we saw in the Political Barometer, there should be a murder pamphlet for Peter Schaefer, but I have not been able to track that down. Now, here we have another Poughkeepsie Journal article. The Friday last, agreeable to sentence Peter Schaefer was executed at this place, meaning Poughkeepsie. So we see here that Peter Schaefer, I was only able to find a couple of mentions of his execution in the papers. It took place on July 19th, 1805. And he must have found religion while he was sitting in the slammer for a bit, because there were like 4 or 5 priests that attended his execution, and they were even singing hymns before his execution took place, which I found pretty interesting. Now, they led the crowd of people who attended the execution in prayer, and the prisoner sang along with the hymns. Now, the papers claimed that there was somewhere between 5,000 to 10,000 people at his execution. I don't think there was 10,000 people in Dutchess County in 1805. So I think they're kind of blowing that up a little bit. But hey, maybe. Now, this particular execution would have taken place most likely. There were a couple different execution locations in Poughkeepsie. There was supposedly a tree near what's now Pulaski Park where executions took place. I've seen mentions of executions taking place on South Hamilton Street, not exactly sure where. I've also, of course, seen many executions take place right in the Dutchess County Courthouse. So they're kind of happening all over the place at this particular time. Now, here we come to an interesting case that is interesting only because of supposed words that a son would utter on his deathbed. This is in 1806, and once again, we're in Fishkill. So we're going down to Fishkill to the farm of the Wood family. Now, we have Jesse Wood, who's the father, and he has two sons, Joseph Wood and Hezekiah Wood. Now, apparently they were out in their field, the three of them, on July 8th, 1806, and a fight broke out between the father, Jesse, and his son, Joseph. Apparently the fight got so bad that the father, Jesse, ran back to the house, grabbed a gun, came back, and shot his son, Joe, in the chest, to which he died instantly. Now, the original court documents, which we actually have in our collections, talk about this particular nasty incident. And this is in our little book, our little box, Miscellaneous Murders, that so intrigued me when I first started working there. This case kind of blows up. And apparently there's also a murder pamphlet for this one too. Here we have part of it that was being produced by the Poughkeepsie Journal. Now, Jesse Wood claimed that this was entirely misunderstood. He did not commit any crimes. In fact, he had told his son Hezekiah that if anyone says anything about this particular death of the son Joseph, that Hezekiah was to say that Joseph accidentally shot himself while trying to hunt a woodpecker. That seems entirely unlikely. This is a 24-year-old boy. It's 1806. The kid's probably been around guns his entire life, right? He's probably been hunting regularly by this point. So the idea of him accidentally shooting himself seems pretty slim. And nobody else believed that either. And Hezekiah decided not to proclaim that at the trial because he's like, Dad, nobody's going to believe this. So Hezekiah spills the beans, essentially. And at the trial, this is an image I found that looks like it would probably represent this time period pretty well, I think. You can imagine the Dutchess County Courthouse in 1806 with all these guys hanging around and a judge pointing his finger down at Mr. Jesse Wood. And the judge, his name was Judge David Brooks, who served honorably in the American Revolution and clearly did not have any time for fathers who murder their sons. So he went on for quite a long time on this interesting statement that I was able to find, and I just want to read it to you. This is Judge David Brooks talking to Jesse Wood at the trial. Your situation is then hopeless as to this life. You are standing on the brink of eternity. Your body must sink into the gloomy mansions of the dead, and your immortal soul must wing its way to the presence of an offended God to render the account for the actions in this life. Are you prepared for this awful change? Have you any hope when you arrive at the bar of eternal justice that you can answer the cries of vengeance that ascend from the blood of your murdered son? Is there no hope? Must you sink down into endless despair? And he goes on and on and on and on, but you get the point. I mean, he is just going to town on this guy. So anyway, Jesse proclaimed that he had nothing to fear because he did not kill his son. Anyway, it didn't take long for the jury to say, no, you did. So this was, let's see, did I write down exactly how long it took the jury? I think an hour and a half Took an hour and a half for the jury to find him guilty. Now, once again, we see a notice from Sheriff Joseph Thorne in the paper asking for all local constables to gather up and help with the process of marching this guy to the site of execution. Now, on the 5th day of December, Jesse Wood was taken to the gallows and hanged. Now, weird rumors pop up much, much later. Apparently, on the deathbed of the other son, Hezekiah apparently proclaimed that it was actually he who shot his brother and let his father hang for the crime. Now, I just saw a rumor of this in one paper. I don't know if that's true or not, but it sounded pretty juicy. Either way, Jesse is the one that paid. Now, here we have an unsolved murder. Most of the murders that I was researching were solved, but I did come across one interesting one from 1832 that went unsolved, and I was never able to find any finish to it, whether or not it was ever officially solved or not. And this was the murder of Catherine Jane Taylor, who had been a household servant in the city of Poughkeepsie. Well, then the village of Poughkeepsie. It's not a city yet. She had worked for the Allen family, which would have been, their estate would have been somewhere along South Road, just south of the city of Poughkeepsie. She was found to be beaten and strangled to death in the woods near the river, about 1.5 miles south of the city proper. She was only 35 years old. Now, a couple of men were brought in for questioning, but nobody was ever found guilty of the crime, and at least I didn't find any source that said that the crime was ever fully figured out. But it does beg the question: how many other unsolved mysteries of murders in the 19th century have gone forgotten? I don't know. Now, in 1841, we come to a trial of what seems to be a crime of passionate anger, shall we say. And the Poughkeepsie Eagle was so intrigued by this case that they decided to fill an entire page's worth on this particular case. In fact, in the paper, they proclaimed, quote, "We occupy a large portion of this paper with a full report of the trial of James Fitzgerald for the murder of Michael Quigg in this village July last. It will be found so interesting that we presume no reader will regret the absence of variety in our columns in order to make room for it." So it's like, yeah, nobody cares what Congress is doing. We want to know what's about this murder. This sounds juicy. So yeah, this is, they weren't joking. This is, this is just 1 page. And this is just a small part of it. I couldn't get the whole thing on here of this case. Now, Michael Quigg was an Irishman, and he worked as a contractor, and he was an ore digger. He had an employee named James Fitzgerald, and the two seemed to fight each other quite regularly, right from the beginning of the employment of these two guys. Now, they fought each other so frequently that Silas Haight, who worked as a magistrate for the village, was so sick and tired of them coming in and having these battles. He's like, "You two again? Get out of my office. Kiss and make up. I don't care. Just get out of the office." So it was well known throughout Poughkeepsie that these two were at each other's throats. Now, Fitzgerald was boarding in the home of Henry Whalen when suddenly, on the night of July 10th, 1841, he stormed out of the house before eating his dinner. And everybody thought that was very odd. This man never missed dinner. They thought, where is he going? So Fitzgerald made his way towards a small bridge on the northern end of the city of Poughkeepsie, a bridge that crosses over the Fallkill Stream. Where there, he ran into his boss, Michael Quigg. Now, this is a map. Actually, this map is from 1835. So it's just a few years before this murder takes place. And that red circle that you see there is the bridge and where the murder actually takes place. And if we compare it to a modern day view, this is it right here. So this is Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel Church is off to the left. You can just see the steeple off to the left there. And And if you're looking straight ahead, you can see the walkway over the Hudson up there. And La Delicioso's bakery is over here, right? Everybody knows that place. It's like, whew, the best baked goods in Poughkeepsie. And anyway, lots of good little shops there. But so anyway, this is where this murder would have taken place way back in 1841. Now, they had a fight, of course, because that's what these two guys do, Fitzgerald and Quigg. They fought it out. And then others heard a man yell out. And when they ran to the scene, they found Michael Quigg bleeding on the ground and just about near death. Fitzgerald had fled the scene. But he made his way back to his boarding house. So apparently he's like, I'm ready for dinner now. So anyway, it didn't take long before Quigg died of his injuries. He'd been pretty much bashed in the head with a rock that Fitzgerald had found nearby. So tough way to go. And so interestingly, at the trial, the newspapers felt the need to mention that there were women sitting in the courtroom for the first time. So this is 1841, and ladies are attending the trial. And now mostly it's women who watch the murder documentaries. So I guess it all started back then too. Now it took about 2 hours for the jury to find Fitzgerald guilty of manslaughter in the first degree. And he was sentenced to life in prison. And he went to this fabulous joint here, Sing Sing. This image is a later image, but pretty much always looks like this. So yeah, nice place to call home for the rest of your life. Yes.
When did they stop hanging people?
That's an excellent question. Here in New York, the last, well, let's see.
You have to repeat the question.
Oh, repeat the question. So for those watching, this lady up here has asked, when did they stop hanging people? I can tell you that the last, I know as far as public executions are concerned, the last public execution here in New York takes place in 1860, and that's public execution. They were still hanging people indoors after that, but 1860 was the last public one. And then, of course, they eventually moved on to Old Sparky after that. When did that come out? About, I think that was by the 1880s, 1890s. They were using the electric chair. Can't remember the exact date on that one. And then the last public execution in the country was, I want to say 1936 in Kentucky. And 20,000 people attended that one because everyone's like, it's the last public execution, we gotta go. Because that was the chief entertainment back in the day. I think 10,000 people attended the last execution here in New York in 1860, so public execution. But that's a good question. I think you have to find out the exact date when the electric chair comes into play, and that's when they kind of stop with the hangings. Now, our next case coming up is the case of Mr. Wesley Pine. And he had been rumored to have been a man with many problems, perhaps sort of mental disability there. At least that was the defense that they used during the trial. Now, while on the other hand, he may have just been a jealous man in love who resorted to murder. Now, this occurs on January 9th, 1848 in Pleasant Valley. And a lot of stuff goes down in 1848 in Pleasant Valley. Like, there were a lot of murders, a lot. And I'm like, what the heck was in the water in 1848 in Pleasant Valley? And at the first time I did this presentation, some guy piped up and said, that's just Pleasant Valley. But there's a lot of stuff going on. I'm going to talk about 2 of the murders that I discovered that year. The other one I decided not to talk about because it involves the killing of an infant, and it was just nasty. And I'm like, we're going to skip that. Anyway, Mr. Wesley Pine entered the home of Mrs. Elizabeth Russell on January 9th, 1848. Her husband had gone off to church that morning. So she was there in the house along with another little girl who I think was like a servant and a gentleman who was boarding at the house. Mr. Wesley Pine entered the house and claimed that Mrs. Russell owed him $200. To which she said, I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't know you anything. I don't even know who you are. And he continued to proclaim that she owed him, or maybe her husband owed him $200. When she said, you're ridiculous and you need to leave my home, He then pulled out an Allen's patent pistol that he purchased from William Berry, who was a gunsmith in the city of Poughkeepsie, just a couple days beforehand, and he shot her right in the chest. Now, the bullet went through her 7th rib, missed her heart, and lodged near her spine. She was then taken to the kitchen where they laid her out on the table, where she sort of bled to death, essentially. And Mr. Pine ran for the hills. He got out of there pretty quickly. Dr. Calvert Canfield showed the bullet to the courtroom that he had pulled from Mrs. Mrs. Russell just before her death. I'm so used to talking about the Roosevelts, right? I'm slipping the name in there. Now, the poor, sad husband, Mr. Russell, his name was Mr. Benjamin Russell, had gone to church that day, like I said, so he got back just in time to find his wife dead on the kitchen table. Now, she had blood all over her dress, and he said that she was aware of the person that had shot her, but didn't know him that well. Now, John Gio, who was a man who was in the house at the time, said he was barely able to escape with his life. Now, for the prosecution, it was clearly an open and shut case. The man shot down an innocent woman in cold blood. There was mention that Mr. Pine had been romantically attached to Mrs. Russell, but she had proclaimed that she wasn't terribly aware of him when on her death table, shall we say. Now, he was caught just a few days after the incident. He didn't get that far. And the newspapers claimed that his only regret was that he, quote, didn't succeed in killing Mr. Russell as well. So definitely a screw loose, I think. Now, this is a document that we have, a court document in our collections at the Agents Memorial Library. The defense was sure that this poor Mr. Pine was a victim of a mental disease, as they quoted in their defense. That this crime was not committed by a sane man, but a man inflicted with insanity. The defense also claimed that mental illness, ran in the family. They came armed with several witnesses, and all spoke on many issues, including the fact that his father had taken his own life by hanging himself from a tree. Now, they also proclaimed that his sister was also mad, apparently that she had preached in a strange manner at a Quaker meeting. Well, that's usually what happens at Quaker meetings, right? Ladies can get up and do their thing and speak, and when you feel the spirit, you get up and you speak, right? And it's not strange. But the defense was like, "Whoa, she's a female preacher at a Quaker meeting. Oh no, she's lost her mind." No. So I'm not buying it. The jury wasn't buying it. Yeah. A few of the witnesses even claimed to have watched Mr. Pine attempt to shoot himself on several occasions, and he failed on several occasions. The defense certainly did a good job of making it seem like Mr. Pine was out of his mind. But the prosecutors used some doctors to claim that he had known Mr. Pine and never saw any insanity in him before, and this was a whole lot of hogwash. The jury took a grand total of 1 hour and 15 minutes to find him guilty. Now, Wesley Pine was sentenced to death by hanging. And was this killing the killing of passion? Was it premeditated? Hard to say. Now, was he truly suffering from a mental illness? Also difficult for us to know. But he was put to death within the walls of the county jail on May 26, 1848. So this was not actually a public execution. It took place indoors. This was actually common in some situations. On a side note, and I mentioned this when I did write a note in here on the last public executions. Yeah, 1860, I was right, I remember that one. And 1936 in Kentucky was the last one in the country, the last public execution in the country. So I did have my dates right. Now, our next case is another Pleasant Valley one. This is another article that I found. That Mr. Pine died comparatively easy, struggling but very little. After hanging for half an hour, he was cut down, having been pronounced dead. Okay, very detailed. Now, the next case, also Pleasant Valley, also 1848. This is the case of Dr. Joel Devine. And he murdered a man named Richard Wall. Now, as I said before, I was really wondering what was going on in Pleasant Valley in 1848. It's hard to say, but there's a lot of murders going on, and they're not connected at all. But this one is kind of interesting because while the Wesley Pine case is playing out, and while Dr. Joel Devine commits this murder, he actually proclaims, "This is the next Pine case." Because he knows what's going on in the papers, and he knows what he's done, and he realizes he's next. Now, this is May 25th, 1848. Richard Wall and several other men were employed on the property of John Newcomb in Pleasant Valley, and they were employed in building a stone wall on his property. Now, Dr. Joel Devine, the neighbor next door, apparently did not approve of the location of this stone wall. He claimed that it was blocking one of his roads. So he kept going out and yelling at all these men who were working for Mr. Newcomb, including this poor workman named Richard Wall. Now, Dr. Devine had gone out to speak to these workers on many occasions and had finally had enough, essentially. So he ran back into his house, where his wife begged him not to do anything stupid. He ignored her, grabbed a gun, and ran back out to the field. Now, some of his workers were also in the field, and they saw him charging across the field with gun in hand. And he ran over to just one of the random workers, and it just happened to be this poor guy named Richard Wall. Other witnesses, including people who worked for the doctor, saw the two of them having a fight. And then one of the witnesses proclaimed that he heard Dr. Devine say, "Richard, I have told you of this long enough." And then suddenly he heard a shot. So this nasty little play here, this little play of words and shot take place. Dr. Joel Devine stands there over the body of Richard Wall. He was killed immediately. And the man who was working for him, Edward Hilliker, said, you have not killed him, have you?" And that's when Dr. Devine said, "This is the second Pine case. If they won't go accordingly to the law, they must suffer the consequences." Which is, what makes you the law, buddy? You're a doctor. Anyway, he went back to his house, sat down, and quietly waited for the police to arrive. Which, of course, they came. They found the body of Richard Wall and found Dr. Devine and said, "Well, you're under arrest." So it was a pretty easy situation there. Now, here's the Dutchess County Courthouse. This is the building where this trial would have taken place, and many of these trials take place. Now, the lawyers, once again, were trying to proclaim that Dr. Devine was insane, and that there was a history of mental illness in his family, even so much as getting his own father to come and testify. His father, Abraham Devine, walked to the bench and proclaimed, quote, "I am 84 years old and the father of the prisoner. My wife and myself were own cousins. On my wife's side, a brother and a mother were crazy some years ago." And he kind of goes on and on about how messed up the family is. So there were some other insane outbursts in the courtroom, but the defense were like, "Look, he's a doctor. He's not only is a doctor, but he's served on his village's committees. He's a respected businessman and farmer. Now you're telling us he's insane, and he has been all this time." So it's quite this interesting case. Now this is the judge here, Judge Edmonds, Judge John W. Edmonds, and he's the Supreme Court justice in this case. And then he went on to tell the jury, he's like, "Look, I don't envy you guys because this is a really tricky case. This is a respected man in his community, and he clearly shot the guy. Like, everybody saw it. So it's a really tough situation. So tough, in fact, that the jury could not make a decision, and they were deadlocked on this particular one. So Devine was sent back to jail to await a possible second trial. But apparently Devine didn't feel like waiting. On November 29th, 1848, the sheriff was checking the cells in the county jail to check to see if the prisoners were secure. In Devine's cell, he found the prisoner face down on the ground in a pool of blood. The doctor had slit his own throat in his jail cell. he had managed to conceal a surgeon's kit on his person. Top-notch security back then, huh? Wow. I guess they didn't do checkings on people going in and out of these places. Anyway, he decided he didn't feel like waiting for another trial. He was going to take care of the matter on his own. And so he took his own life in the basement of that horrible place. Now he's actually buried in the cemetery at Washington Hollow, not far from the scene of the crime, actually. Now this next one, this is a real doozy of a crime, and probably because she could have gotten away with it if she was smart, but she's not. Now I say this after watching several documentaries, murder documentaries. I'm like, oh yeah, okay, I see how it's done. Okay, this is bad. And my coworker and I were sitting in, we have a shared office in the local history room. And as I'm sitting there at my desk researching this case and reading all through the documents and things, and one day I was like, no, not the oysters. This, and I referred to her in a certain word that we're not going to reuse in this particular circumstance here, but I said, this beach killed her husband with the oysters. I was like, she put arsenic in the oysters. And my coworker goes, girlfriend didn't need to do that. Just leave those out for a couple days. That'll do it. So there's a lot of things that she could have done to gotten away with this crime, but she's not the brightest crayon in the box, shall we say. Now, interestingly, while I was working on this case, one of my other coworkers who had come in and was like, oh, what are you doing? I'm like, oh, well, I found this interesting case of this woman who murdered her husband. It was very, very early. This is 1852. This is a really early murder. And she killed him. She's like, my hero. And I was like, what? She's like, yeah. She's like, get it, girl. And I'm like, no, he didn't deserve it. And she's like, how do you know? Maybe she did the world a favor. Maybe she is a hero. And I was like, okay. So, interesting point of view. Now, I don't know what was going on in this marriage. We only have her side of the story. We don't have her husband's. But she laid it all out in this murder pamphlet, The Life and Confessions of Lucy Ann Hoag. These things sold like hotcakes because of female murders. This was unheard of in this particular time and place. So we're going to get into the life of Lucy Ann Hoag. Now, we're not sure exactly when she was born because she's not sure exactly when she was born, but we're thinking somewhere around 1821. She had remembered being adopted as a child. She doesn't remember her parents. And she remembered being the adopted child of a man named Henry Fulton from Red Hook, New York. Now, she had said that she had maybe met her mother briefly when she was young, but she remembers the lady being quite cold, and she kind of hoped it wasn't her mother, if that's the case. Now, she said that she had a horrible childhood, and she was essentially a indentured servant. She had to work in the field. She had to work in the house. She wasn't allowed to go to church. She wasn't allowed to do anything fun. And so she remembers that it was quite a miserable growing up. Then suddenly a man from nowhere came and swept her off her feet, shall we say. This guy named Nelson Hoag. And he was from Dover. Nelson was a widower, slightly older than she was. He was 32. She was 17 when they met. And he was actually coming to the Fulton household because one of his sisters was marrying into the Fulton family. So he and Lucy apparently hit it off. After a couple of meetings, he said, let's get married. So the Fulton family said, all right, we'll give you $500 and some household furnishings if you take her off our hands. Sounds good. So they get married, and the Fultons never hold that promise. They never give the $500. They never give the household furnishings. So Mr. Hoag said, that's it. We're not coming back to Red Hook. So off to Dover they went to start their married lives. Now, Lucy claims that she was treated very harshly, and not so much by Nelson, but by his sisters. His sisters were very mean to her, saying that Nelson would have been better off if he had married a Negro girl, things like that. She felt very put down by these women. She said that she took on various jobs, like sewing rugs and knitting things and fixing things, and that all the money that she brought in, Nelson took from her. That she couldn't have what she was making, so she felt kind of, I don't know, abused and used once again, just like she was when she was a child. Now, they did have 5 children together during the course of their marriage. Now, she said that they worked in the fields all the time, her and her husband. But, I mean, it's the 19th century and you live in Dover. Yeah, you're going to be working in the fields. That's what they're doing. What else are you going to do? So, I don't know. It's the 19th century. So Lucy claims that when Nelson began having some real money problems on a piece of land that he had purchased, and apparently he invested very poorly and started doing very financially, he was not doing well. She said that at this point his health started to deteriorate too, and he became quite feeble, as she put it. It was at this time, this is in the spring of 1851, that she also made a point of saying that Nelson began suffering headaches on a regular basis, constantly getting these nasty headaches. Now, also about this time, she was proclaiming that she was going around telling people that Nelson was not doing very well, and she's not sure how long he's going to continue on like this. So she's going around telling people this stuff. So this is in the spring of 1851. Now, right about this time, Nelson took on a boarder to help with the farm work, and his name was William Somers. This is not the actual Somers. This is just some random image that I found of what I like to refer to as a horticultural hunk. Now, this horticultural hunk, Mr. Somers, Lucy claimed that she had no interest in him. Oh no, at her trial, I had no interest in Mr. Somers, none at all. But he did play a mean fiddle. Those fiddle players will get you every time, I'm telling you, especially when they're horticultural hunks like this guy. Now, June of 1851, Nelson apparently began to get really ill at this point. Dr. Hooker, the family doctor, was called in to examine and prescribe some medication. Lucy claimed that Nelson sent her and William, Mr. Somers, to New Milford, Connecticut, to pick up some supplies, some fish, some meat, and to go to the local grocery store there just to get some things. Now, just to give you an idea, this is a map from the 1860s. And you can see with the red circle where it says N Hoag, so there's the Nelson Hoag. There's a lot of Hoags in that area. There still are a lot of Hoags in that area. And you can see that the border of Connecticut's not far. So it's not that far from the Hoag home in Dover to New Milford, Connecticut. A nice carriage ride. It will take you most of the day to get out there, get your supplies, and come back. Now, while she was out there, she entered the store of Mr. Treat, where she purchased arsenic at that time. And Mr. Treat was at the trial later on, and he proclaimed that she had purchased arsenic. Now, Lucy claims that she never purchased arsenic at any time, and during the course of her trial, she said, "I hope to be struck down dead if I ever seen or touched the stuff." Yeah, okay. Now, there are different opinions about what happens next. They get back to the Hoag farm, where Lucy prepares oysters. Now, the sisters of Mr. Hoag claim that she would not let anyone else see her prepare these oysters, and that she would not let anybody else have the oysters except for her husband. Everybody else got ham and clams, but she was giving the oysters to her husband. Now, she, Lucy, said at the trial, "Oh, no, we all had oysters. They were fabulous. Everybody had oysters. The kids, me." His sisters must be remembering things wrong because they had oysters too. Yeah. Now, after this, we're starting to get even more depression, or I should say more sickness from Mr. Hoag. Lucy was also going around telling people how sad and melancholy Mr. Hoag was from his financial worries, and how he was so upset that he had been such a poor manager of the finances, and an even poorer husband, maybe setting the scene for suicide. She's going around telling everybody this in the town. Now, 4 days later, let me see. Oh, here's some oysters, by the way. Love this painting. Beautiful oysters. A few days later, Nelson was still very unwell. Lucy said that she was going to go out to the local store in Dover. And so he said, well, here's some things you can put on our credit, our store credit. And here's a couple of shillings. I need you to pick up some arsenic. He says, we have a problem with the mice getting into the feed out in the barn. We'll put together some arsenic and Indian meal to take care of those mice, those rats. He said, but I want you to buy this arsenic at the local store. So she goes to the local store, where apparently she buys everything on the family store credit with the exception of the arsenic, which she uses 2 shillings for. And once again, the clerk at the store, a different store, remember, this one was in Dover, said, now be careful with this stuff. It's very poisonous, very dangerous stuff. And she said, yeah. She takes it, she goes back to the house. Now, apparently, when she gets back to the house, her husband tells her, you must put the arsenic someplace where the children won't get to it. But in the meantime, I will show you how to prepare the Indian meal and how to put the arsenic in it to kill the rats. Now, when she returns to his bedside after doing the things that he had requested, he apparently now had the vial of arsenic and a teacup, and he was pouring it in, she proclaimed, saying how depressed, how melancholy he was. And she's like, no, everything's going to be fine. This is all stuff she's saying at the trial. And then suddenly he drinks the teacup of arsenic in front of her. And she's like, what are you doing? This is all stuff she's saying happens. Now, sure enough, all of this arsenic that he is consuming, whether it's him trying to kill himself or her poisoning the oysters or a combination of both, well, surely enough, he will die as a result of this consumption of far too much arsenic. In the early morning hours of July the 3rd, 1851, Nelson died in his rocking chair in his home in Dover. Now, he was quickly buried the next day in the Weebatuck burial ground, which you see here. Now, it didn't take long for Lucy and her boy toy, oops, we're going backwards now. No. Okay. For Lucy and her boy toy, Mr. William Summers, to pack up house and get out of Dodge, where they decided to head over to Connecticut, as a matter of fact. Now, she had pretty much sold off her husband's house, sold off anything that she could, livestock, whatever she can think of, in order to get out of there and start a new life with her boy, William Summers. Now, Nelson's sisters were very perplexed by this whole series of events, saying, this has happened far too quickly, we don't like it. So they proclaimed that it was time to do a proper autopsy. So the sisters went ahead and hired some men to dig up their brother's remains. Then several men assisted in this ordeal of doing a proper autopsy. They actually took him to Poughkeepsie, where Reuben Chapin, John Henry Baker, Dr. William Hooker, Dr. D.E. Stillman, and a coroner, Edward P. Taylor, all got together and started working on the remains of Mr. Hoag. They found enough swelling and arsenic in his liver and stomach to have caused death. So, with this knowledge, the Dutchess County Sheriff decided that Lucy Ann should be questioned properly. Now, they went over to Connecticut, where they found Lucy Ann Hoag and her boy toy, William Summers, all cozied up in a new home in Connecticut, and said, you're coming back with us. Now, the trial gets underway in March of 1852, and it caught a lot of interest. I mean, everybody was just glued to this thing. Like I said, these pamphlets, these murder pamphlets sold like hotcakes. Everybody wanted a piece of this action. They could not believe what was happening here. Now, this particular man here, this is Justice Seward Barculo. He oversaw the trial. Now, when the fact came out that she had purchased arsenic, not once, but twice, because they had both clerks come and testify, the clerk from the Connecticut grocery store and the clerk from the Dover grocery store, and they both said, she bought arsenic from us. And both times, they said, we told her it's dangerous. Also, a lot of witnesses proclaiming that she was going around telling everybody, oh, my husband's going to die soon. he's not long for this world. And everyone's like, isn't he suffering from headaches? Like, what? Why is he going to die from a headache? You know, like, it's this really weird situation where they didn't really understand that arsenic was in his system until they had done this autopsy. And then they realized she's poisoning him. So between the clerks and the sisters and other folks, this horrible crime came down to this. The judge told the jury, quote, "If this horrible crime has been committed by this prisoner, it should be punished. You stand between her and the public, and your duty is to both. If she is innocent, you must preserve her from the sword of the law that is suspended over her head. You are not to presume she is innocent because she is a woman, nor because she has children, nor because of the punishment, which of course was death." Now, here we have an interior view of the Dutchess County Courthouse. This is mid-19th century here. So this is roughly what it would have looked like at the time. After only 2 days of witnesses and testimony, the jury did not take long to find Lucy Ann Hoeg guilty of murder. She was informed that she was to be hanged by the neck until dead on the 7th of May. However, that date would change. Now, I don't know if they realized it at the time, but during the trial, she began showing signs of pregnancy. That's right, Mr. William Summers had knocked her up. Well, they can't kill an innocent baby now, can they? So they decided they better hold off. Now, this gentleman here is Washington Hunt, the governor of New York at the time. She gave birth to a little baby girl on April 20th, 1852, in her cell. Washington Hunt wrote a letter to the Dutchess County Sheriff, Alonzo Maury, saying that it was best to hold off the execution so that she could properly nurse the child, but that the execution should still totally happen. Like, she's not getting away with this. You still got to kill her. So he apparently didn't have any sympathy for this new mom. And Lucy sat in her prison cell with her newborn baby, and she was informed of her new execution date, July 30th. And also that she wouldn't be alone. What's that you say? Lucy would share the gallows with another murdering scoundrel? Lucy would actually share with this young man right here, Mr. Jonas Williams. Now, he was convicted of murdering his stepdaughter. Apparently, he raped and murdered his stepdaughter as a way to get back to his nasty girlfriend, or nasty wife/girlfriend. And it was a really horrible crime, actually. This was also in 1852. Jonas Williams had been born the son of freed slaves in this area. And that he was apparently, this particular murder pamphlet proclaims that he was, quote, half Negro, half Indian. Now, he was born in 1825, and that he had grown up a very happy, lovely childhood, not quite the childhood that Lucy Ann had had, that things were quite good in his environment, that he was a regular church-going man, and that he was said to have been a great part of his community, but that he had accidentally gotten into a nasty relationship with someone that apparently he claimed she was the one who was driving him mad, Catherine Amelia Poe. And I'm sorry, not Catherine Amelia, that was the daughter. Latita was her name, this woman he was having a relationship with, and that he had gone ahead and killed, or supposedly raped and killed Catherine Amelia Poe, this 13-year-old daughter of hers. So that was a nasty one. They caught him. He was running across the frozen Hudson River, heading towards Newburgh with an axe in his hand, and they finally caught this guy. And they decided that they would kill two birds with one stone, essentially, at this next execution. So July 30th comes along. Now, perhaps the saddest thing is just a couple of days beforehand, they took Lucy Ann's newborn baby away from her. And she said, quote, "Now let them execute me. I have nothing to live for. And she went fairly easy to the gallows. Now, the gallows were constructed inside the main hall of the Dutchess County Courthouse. They built a special gallows just for this particular double execution. The newspapers decided to write an interesting piece. They said, a gallows constructed for the purpose had been erected in the main hall, which could be seen through the windows. And about these were all the morning gathered miscellaneous groups of eager gazers at the pieces of wood, iron weights, ropes, and straps combined in the machine that stood firm, staunch, immovable, silent, and ready and waiting to do quick and sure work. My goodness, did they love to write about this stuff back then. Now, both Lucy and Jonas walked quietly into the hall. Both were dressed in white. Sheriff Maury asked them both. He said, have my staff been kind to you? Have you been treated fairly at your stay here? Like, why, yes. I give this 5 stars on Yelp. Like, the food was so-so, but you guys were like, really? Okay. Anyway, they were both hanged at 12 noon after a short prayer. And if you're wondering what happened to lover boy William Summers, that guy, not that guy, but there was a separate trial for him, but he was acquitted. So nothing ever happened of him. Apparently they were convinced that Lucy Ann was alone in her doings of murdering her husband, and William just happened to be hanging out with a murdering wife at the time. Now, keeping in the theme of lady killers, by the way, this is an excellent read, Lady Killers. You can find this at the Poughkeepsie Public Library. Tori Telfler is the author, and the book just talks about all the various female killers in history. It's an interesting read. But in this book, I discovered this lady right here. Now, this is kind of interesting because this woman is not Lizzie Borden. That's the famous Lizzie, but this one is Lizzie Holiday. Now, she is supposedly the first female serial killer. Now, when I was reading about her history, at first I was a little dismayed because most of her crimes are taking place across the river. And I said, no, this is Dutchess County murders only. We're not touching the other side of the river. We're not gonna, there's enough stuff to cover here. And then I was reading her story. I'm like, oh, all the murders she's doing are over there. Until her last murder, which was here in Dutchess County. So I was like, oh, good, we can talk about it. So we'll start at the beginning of this very interesting, very crazy woman. Elizabeth McNally was how she was her birth name. She was born in Ireland in 1860. She came over to the U.S. as a child with her parents and 9 other siblings, one of which, John, would later say that the family was essentially parted ways with Lizzie early on because of her outbursts of anger and her just overall bad behavior. Like, apparently she was just nasty and terrified her family even as a young girl. So we're not starting out at a good note here, essentially. Apparently she had been married and divorced at least 3 times before the age of 20, and that she had tried to kill at least 2 of those husbands. So we got a real winner here, folks. Now, I'm going back to this guy for a second because a lot of the images that I've used so far have been just kind of like sketches that are not the actual people. Now we're coming into a time period when there's more accurate images and even some photography. So we're going to get into some more interesting folks. This is a newspaper image of Lizzie that came out when she first started causing trouble, which was in Philadelphia. She had moved to Philadelphia, where she opened a shop and she insured the shop and then proceeded to set it on fire to collect the insurance money, which she also burned down a small part of Philadelphia in the process. So she was actually sent to Eastern State Penitentiary for this little stunt. Now, apparently, while she was there, she was so well behaved and so nice that they let her go. Mistake number 1. After getting out of prison, Lizzie made her way to New York, where she went to Newburgh. And there she met an old Civil War veteran by the name of Paul Holiday. Now, Paul Holiday needed some help on his farm. So he said, well, I'll hire you. You can come work on my farm up in Sullivan County. So she said, okay. She went along. She started working on the farm. And then he said, yeah, you know what? It'd be cheaper if I just married you. So they got married. Now, he had several children from a previous marriage. All of his children were older and moved on, with the exception of one son, who was still living on the farm because he had a physical disability, so he was kind of impaired. So, in May of 1891, Mr. Holliday went off to a job about 10 miles away from his farm. When he returned, he found his cabin in flames and his disabled son burnt to a crisp. Lizzie claimed that she was just barely able to get out with her own life, that she couldn't possibly have carried him out as well. So he said, well, I'm glad you made it out. Okay, I see. Meanwhile, his other children were like, this is really suspicious, Dad. Are you sure this wasn't on purpose? Well, the police came and investigated, but they could find no evidence of a crime. Now, later, she was actually charged with stealing horses with, quote, a gang of gypsies that she had temporarily joined. And at a trial, she screamed and ripped her clothes and punched the jailers. She was sent to a nearby asylum until May of 1893, when she was released and sent back to her very forgiving husband, who said, that's okay, come on back home. Now, poor Mr. Holliday probably was either really lonely or had a thing for crazy Irish redheads. I don't know, but he took her back, which was mistake number 2. Now, Mr. Holliday vanished in 1893. And it was quite a shock that he was nowhere to be found. The police came and she said, oh, he just went off to do a job like he always does. He just hasn't come back. Maybe something happened. Once again, his children were like, oh, something's really suspicious here. Can we search the farm, please? So while they were searching the farm, they ended up coming across the bodies of 2 women. These ladies right here, Margaret McQuillan and her young daughter, Sarah Jane McQuillan. Now, apparently, 19-year-old Sarah Jane had been living on her farm with her family, the McQuillans. Her mother also kind of working on that farm as well. About a week before the bodies were discovered, the mother, Margaret, here on the left, received a visit from a woman claiming to be Mrs. Smith, who needed help on her farm. So she said, I'd be happy to help you. So she went along with Mrs. Smith. A few hours later, Mrs. Smith came back and found the daughter, Sarah Jane. Something terrible has happened to your mother. I need your assistance right away. Sarah Jane said, well, of course. And so she went along with Mrs. Smith. Well, sadly, they were both shot to death by this Mrs. Smith, aka Mrs. Holliday. The 2 bodies were discovered in a barn, essentially, while the police were in the process of looking for Mr. Holliday. So it starts to get a little weird. And the police are like, well, this is looking more and more like a serious issue here. Now, after questioning Mrs. Holliday, who's kind of wandering around aimlessly at this point, 2 other police were looking under the floorboards of the kitchen of the house, where they soon discovered the badly decomposed remains of Mr. Holliday. Now, he had been shot and hit in the head by something very heavy, so heavy, in fact, that his eye had fallen out of its socket, apparently. And it was a really nasty, nasty crime. He had just been barely covered in dirt, just barely. So Lizzie went to jail on September 8th, 1893, to the Monticello jail, to be specific, where she put on quite a show, kicking, screaming, making a scene. This is another drawing from the local newspaper of the bodies of the 2 women found under the barn. The newspapers just absolutely blew this up. The body of Paul Holliday found buried under his house. Triple murder. This was such a wild, wild case that in October of 1893, the famous reporter by the name of Nellie Bly, and of course, she's very famous, right, for faking her way into an asylum in order to get a good story. Right? Well, she heard about Lizzie Holliday. She's like, oh, I gotta meet her. She's like, I gotta write about this lady. So Lizzie Holliday talks her way into the Monticello jail to sit down and have a little talk with Lizzie Holiday. And when she gets in there, she finds Lizzie sitting with all of these pictures of beautiful women surrounding her on the walls. She was like, oh, this is very, very interesting. She said that she, quote, looked with me what was meant to be a stupid expression, but the cool, cunning gleam of her small pig eyes betrayed the workings of her remarkably shrewd brain. So Nellie was looking right through this woman going, she's a cold-hearted killer. She could see it. Now, if you haven't been able to tell by all of this crazy drawings and newspaper reports, the press was eating this up. They just absolutely loved this. A female serial killer. They were calling her the female Jack the Ripper because of the bodies that were piling up on this woman. Now, she played the insanity game real hard. She was biting people, kicking people. She kicked the doctor. She bit at the district attorney. Here's an image of her ripping her clothes off at the trial, just making a huge scene and just trying to play that insanity game all day long. Now, June 22nd, 1894, she was found guilty and sentenced to die by the electric chair. The first woman sentenced to die at the electric chair in the state of New York. Now, this guy right here, governor of New York, Roswell P. Flower, decided the execution was too harsh. We can't murder her as well. There's been enough death. So, decided instead that she would be shipped off to Mattawa State Hospital for the criminally insane. Mistake again. What? How many mistakes are we up to? Number 3, number 4? There's a lot of mistakes. Now, we're at Dutchess County, Beacon, right? Fishkill, Beacon area. So this is where she commits her final crime. In the prison, which is pretty nasty, actually. The death that she would actually, the murder that she would actually cause here is said to be the first known female law enforcement officer to be killed in the line of duty in the United States. So that's a pretty big deal. Now, they didn't call them corrections officers back then. Female corrections officers, as we know them to be back then, were referred to as nurses in these prisons and asylums. Lizzie had become very fond of this young corrections officer, young nurse, named Nellie Wicks. Nellie Wicks was 21 years old and working at Mattawa State Hospital. Now, this is in 1906, and by now, Lizzie had become a well-known, respected prisoner. She had been very well behaved. She had not caused any trouble. She was even allowed to do sewing projects and stay busy with other various art forms. And she became very close to Nellie Wicks. But Nellie, one day, said, oh, you know, I'm moving on. I'm leaving the prison. I've got a new job. And Lisa said, you can't leave. She was very upset. And Nellie's like, oh, don't worry. There are other nurses and other guards here. You'll be fine. Well, Lizzie did not like this one bit. So on September 27th, 1906, she walked behind Nellie Wicks into a bathroom where she cornered her, locked the door, kept the key in the lock so it'd be harder to get open from the outside, took a pair of scissors and began stabbing the poor girl in the face and chest several times. Nellie's screams for help were heard, but it took some time for the attendants to get in because of what Lizzie had done with the lock. And once again, this brutal attack would end in a horrible death of 21-year-old Nellie Wicks. Lizzie had committed yet another horrible murder. Now, they decided, well, she's already here in prison. There's not much more we can do. So Lizzie would continue to live out her days in the asylum until June 27th, 1918, when she died of Bright's disease at the age of 59. And she's buried in the prison cemetery because nobody wanted her remains. And I understand that. Now, yes?
Did she have a reason for killing the first 2 women?
She never told anybody her reasoning. I think she was just,
Question.
oh, yes. A gentleman here asked, did she ever give any reasoning for killing the first two women? Not that we know of. I think she was just a cold-blooded killer who liked doing it, which is very scary. Someone at that time period, yeah, to do such a thing. So I know we've gone quite a long time. Do you want one more? Or? one more. All right. Okay, we got one more.
Okay.
One more.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Now this one's a doozy. This one's actually kind of famous. Does anyone recognize this house? Aha, here it is today. This is the very beautiful number 16 Garfield Place in the city of Poughkeepsie. Garfield Place is that fabulous street on the south end with beautiful mansions, beautiful big large houses, just grand estates. Garfield Place and Academy Street side by side have these gorgeous Victorian homes. This is a piece of architectural history, and it's also the scene of early 20th century brutal murder. Now, the man who purchased this house in 1918 was this man here, Mr. J. William Schatz. Schatz was the president of the Schatz Federal Bearing Company in the city of Poughkeepsie. Now, this was a major operation. Now, Schatz had brought this business to Poughkeepsie in 1918. They had originally had their business in New Haven. And at the time, Schatz was married, but then divorced. Now, by 1931, when this murder takes place, Mr. Schatz has a new boo in his life. This lovely young 24-year-old Mrs. Florence Quick Caruza. Now, Mrs. Florence Quick Caruza was separated from her husband. He was not in the picture. And she lived not far away on Academy Street with her parents. Now, also living in this beautiful house were the Schatz Butler, this guy here, Juntaro Akiyama. Everybody just called him Yama. And this woman here, named Sadaka Otsaka. Now, supposedly, they were husband and wife. At least that's what he told his employer. They were not. This woman is his sister-in-law. They were posing as husband and wife because his actual wife was dying from TB at Bowen Hospital, which is now Dutchess County Community College. Now, Sadako and Yama were living here in this house as servants. And it was kind of weird to be claiming to be husband and wife, but the Schatz didn't know the difference. Mr. Schatz didn't know. Now, on Saturday, December 19th, 1931, around 7 p.m., J. William Schatz had given Yama an order. And apparently, Yama sassed back, not feeling like taking orders tonight, which is very strange. Now, Mr. Schatz had asked Yama to bring sandwiches and drinks for him and his girlfriend, Florence. And Yama apparently ignored the request and went out to watch the movies instead. So Mr. Schatz was kind of getting fed up with Yama's weird disobeying on this particular evening. Now, when Yama got back from the movies, there was a fight between Mr. Schatz and Yama. They had it out on the servants' staircase. When finally, Schatz proclaimed, "Yama, you're fired. You and your so-called wife are out of here Monday morning." And that was the end of their conversation. Schatz went downstairs, called a local restaurant, ordered some food, and he and his girlfriend went to play cards. Now, at 2 a.m., Mr. Schatz and Florence went upstairs to the second floor master bedroom on the south side of the house to go to bed. Florence said that she remembered that she had heard movement upstairs in the servants' wing above them, on the third floor. She heard lots of walking back and forth and a tussle. And she said, "I couldn't sleep that night. I kept hearing things up above me." Well, suddenly, at the break of dawn, the side window opens and Yama comes flying in. There's a porch on the, let's see, previous. There we go. So you see there's a porch on the south end of the house and a balcony. You can see the two windows there. That's the second floor master bedroom. And then up above that third floor, that's the servant's wing. So he had climbed out of his window on the third floor down to that little porch there, that little balcony, and into the master bedroom, where he proceeded to begin beating Florence while she was in bed. Mr. Schatz woke up, and then a fight ensued. Glass was broken. Mr. Schatz apparently took a hit on the head from a glass bottle that was near the bed from Yama. Now, there were a couple of doors leading out into the hallway, which Florence had locked before they went to bed because she was nervous about that fight. That's why he came in through the window. He couldn't get through the doors. Mr. Schatz had made his way out the door. Yama followed him, and Florence had made her way down the stairs, where she was confronted by the sister-in-law, who then started to fight her. The two women are fighting. The two men are fighting. It is a brutal, brutal fight. Mr. Schatz, Yama, Florence, down the stairs. These are actually photographs of the interior of the house today. God bless Zilla. They went down this beautiful staircase, blood everywhere, fighting back and forth, hitting, stabbing, a little bit of everything. It's bloody. There's a trail of blood going from the second floor down to the first floor and then down into the basement of the house, the servant's basement. Now, Mr. Schatz apparently was knocked unconscious at one point. He was trying to get out the door to yell for help. Florence was able to get to a phone after pushing Sadaka out of the way. Just enough to get on the phone and say, Mr. Schatz is being murdered by Yama. Well, the person on the other end, the operator, heard this and was able to make a call. Meanwhile, Yama dragged Mr. Schatz down to the basement and made one final blow in the head with a hammer, killing Mr. Schatz. Now he was about to turn and grab Florence and kill her as well, make that last final blow, when this patrolman that you see here managed to come to the basement stair door and open it. Patrolman Skinner got there just in the nick of time. Now Yama made a run for it. When when Patrolman Skinner came into the house, he found Mr. Schatz dead on the floor and Florence within an inch of her life. Now he's like, where's the killer? Where did he go? Did he escape? Did he get out of here? Next thing you know, there's a whole bunch of police that have arrived on the scene, besides Patrolman Skinner. You also had detectives. Detective John Powers made his way past Mr. Schatz's body to a furnace towards the back of the basement. There, he found a trail of footprints and blood making their way towards that furnace. There, he uncovered what he thought was another body. But in fact, whoops, not her. Uh-oh. Are we frozen again? There we go. Here we go. This is what he uncovers. Yama, covered in blood. So much so that the blood is still wet and dripping on the tiles on the floor below from his very hands. This was a nasty scene. And by the way, I discovered these photos in the Poughkeepsie Journal archives. They were never published, which is very interesting. I mean, you can see why. They're kind of not exactly newspaper material. So anyway, Yama, when questioned, said, quote, Mr. Schatz and girl fight. I go to guard girl. The girl, Florence, had been taken to the hospital via ambulance. She was still alive. And she's like, no, that is absolutely not what happened. I was not fighting Mr. Schatz. Yama was fighting Mr. Schatz. The district attorney proclaimed that the motive for Yama was clearly the loss of a very lucrative job. His position, he was making $220 a month. In the 1930s, that's pretty good. He had food and board. He was given $125 a month to buy household food supplies. Anything left he could keep. He had a car. He was able to drive all over Poughkeepsie, go to the movies whenever he wanted. He had a good job. So the loss of that very lucrative position was clearly the motive of this crime. Now, Supposedly, the defense said that he had been hit in the head as a child back home in Japan, and that he was prone to rage. Whoops, go ahead, forward. Here we go. This is another photograph that I found in the Poughkeepsie Journal archives of them taking Mr. Schatz's body and putting it in a hearse that's on the side of the house. The district attorney, Mr. Schwartz, made it clear that he wanted to seek indictments for both Yama and Sadaka for first-degree murder, and that if convicted, the harshest death sentence should be made. The first few months of 1932, the trial of Yama and Sadaka was front-page news. I mean, everybody wanted to know what was going to happen. You're in the middle of the Great Depression here. This is hot stuff. Everybody wants to know what's going to happen to these people. Plus, this is a rich man in a really fancy neighborhood in Poughkeepsie. The fact that he was murdered in his own home, I mean, captivated everybody. Now, Yama confessed to his crime, and the defense tried to make it seem like Yama had had a harsh childhood, he'd been hit in the head a lot as a kid, and that this was not, he had, once again, had some insane tendencies bursting out. He denied that he planned to kill Schatz, only that he wanted to give him a good scare. But Florence was ultimately the one who would condemn both of these two by saying, both of them were trying to kill us. It took only 2.5 hours for the jury to find them guilty. Yama was found guilty on first-degree murder, and Sadaka found guilty on second-degree murder. Yama was sentenced to die by the electric chair at Sing Sing. However, I should say Sadaka received a sentence of 20 years to life at Women's State Prison in Bedford. Yama got lucky because then Governor of New York, Franklin D. Roosevelt, said, well, let's not do that. Let's let him sit in prison for the rest of his life. This is before Pearl Harbor. Now, you might be wondering, what about his wife who was suffering from TB at Bound Hospital? She actually died in 1937. What's interesting is that the folks at Sing Sing actually allowed for him to come back to Poughkeepsie to attend her funeral at St. Peter's Cemetery. So she actually, the whole town was like, he's coming back? You're letting this murderer come back to Poughkeepsie? But like, oh, he's going to be in chains. He's going to be in a cemetery mourning his wife. It's okay. Now, apparently, Yama, while he was in prison, wrote a Japanese cookbook that was so well loved in Japan that he had become a minor celebrity back home in Japan. Governor Dewey in 1953 decided to release him, but he would be shipped back to Japan. He was no longer allowed to live in the United States. So he ended up going home. Sadaka also was set free and sent back to Japan in 1933. So they actually did okay in the end. So wow, lots of stuff, right? Now, this, as I said before, I was going to show you an image of the modern day prison cell, right? Here we go. That's what it looks like today in the basement of the Dutchess County Courthouse. Pretty neat, huh? So the moral of the story is don't kill anybody. Otherwise, I'm going to talk about you. So, any questions about this this talk? I know it's a lot. Told you it's going to be a lot. Yes.
Why, you said that there were hangings were taking place in different locations. Some were inside, some were. Was there a rationale for why some would be in some places or others? Just random.
So he asked. Yeah, he asked why were executions sometimes inside, sometimes outside? Why were they so random? That's a really good question, and that I asked myself. And I was never able to find a reason why certain executions were held in some places and others. There was never a good reason for it. I guess I guess it depended on the time and the circumstances. Like, did they want everybody to see this to kind of say, hey, this is what happens if you do this crime? With the case of Lucianne Hoag, they're like, well, it's a woman. We should probably have it indoors and not let everybody see it. So that's a really good question. I was always looking for that particular answer, and I never found it. What was the reasoning for having executions in different spots? Good question. Yes.
One of the early 18th century executions you talked about, the murderer was considered insane and he was executed. When did insanity become, a plea for clemency?
I think they were using that. Oh, yeah. The question, when did insanity become a plea for clemency, right? I mean, in all the cases that I've uncovered, that a lot of that was the case. So certainly going back to the 18th century, maybe if not earlier. That's a really good question. I'm not sure. Were they doing that over in England? I think they were, going way back into the 1700s, 1600s, when it became an official defense mechanism. That's a good question. I don't know, but I'm thinking for quite a while. Certainly, as they were trying to understand mental health, which has always been something that we're still not quite fully educated on mental health and what that means. And but I think they were even less, well aware of how to handle that back then. So I think it's always been something that they've been contemplating and working on. It's a really good thought. Yeah. You had a question?
Do you know when the last time that cell was actually?
Oh, when was the last time this cell was used? I want to say that it was around the 1930s, because by that point they had a jail connected to the courthouse, so they had other cells, but it's been pretty much used as storage since the mid-20th century. Yeah.
Did you say there's some kind of law in the books that?
The deed actually of this particular building, this land, claims that there's always had to be a cell there, yeah, of some kind, which is interesting.
Strange.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I'm gonna. I guess that's it for me.
Thank you, Shannon. This was fascinating. And I see that you've held your audience in rapt attention. So that's really great. And we thank the people that have stuck with us. I think we had up to 16 at the peak here. So this has been a nice, successful program. Thanks to all of your research, Shannon. So thank you for being with us. And thank you for being with us. And help yourselves to some lemonade and cookies. And thanks for being part of our program this evening. Thank you. Okay.
I'm working on part 2.
Thank you. Quite a history.
There's a lot of good juicy stuff.
Yeah.